One day, a fierce beast asked a brave warrior how he intended to fight the monsters before them. A pack of wolves stood nearby, baring their sharp teeth angrily. The beast pointed out that the warrior possessed neither sharp fangs nor powerful claws, while the wolves had already surrounded a terrifying monster. The monster slowly rose to its feet as one of the wolves lifted its head and howled loudly. In response, the creature attacked violently and tore off the head of one of the wolves. Covered in blood and sweat, the monster kicked another wolf aside with enough force to scatter flesh and bones everywhere. White steam escaped from the wolf's mouth as it charged at the creature, but the monster grabbed it by the upper jaw. It declared that it devoured the corpses of its enemies and used those corpses as weapons. The creature then bit deeply into the neck of a massive wolf and ripped a huge piece of flesh from it. It proclaimed that it would kill its enemies first and devour them afterward. Soon, many strange beasts appeared. These magical animals, blessed with supernatural powers, were known as mystical creatures. Among them were beings with human-like features. It was said that only a small number of these creatures had been granted human form by the gods, becoming prophets meant to serve humanity. However, there also existed an evil incarnation of that same power. Before them stood a black-horned dragon. Its terrifying eye came into view, and people later referred to the creature as the god of demons. Meanwhile, a man was seen running desperately through the trees. His trembling legs moved frantically as he begged for mercy. His face was twisted with fear while he cried out for help. Suddenly, a crossbow was aimed at the fleeing man, and an arrow struck him directly in the back. Someone shouted that the shooter had hit the bull's eye. A group of soldiers soon appeared, clearly villainous in appearance. One of them remarked that everything had gone even better than expected, while another casually replied that the task had been easy. Corpses littered the ground before them. Someone ordered the soldiers to take anything valuable, because the detachment needed to return before sunset. As the squad continued through the forest, one soldier commented that the woods felt especially creepy that day. Another responded that there was probably a monster hiding somewhere in the thicket, watching them. A third soldier dismissed the idea as nothing more than rumors. Suddenly, one frightened soldier ordered everyone to stop. The group discovered the corpses of several animals. A bearded warrior stared at the scene in amazement and suggested that the wolves had likely been fighting over territory. However, his comrade rejected the theory and insisted that some kind of bloody massacre had taken place there. One of the soldiers then called for Martin and asked him to examine something unusual, the corpse of a mystical beast. Nearby, an exhausted young man sat on the ground, leaning against the body of a gigantic wolf. Martin observed that the animal was most likely the leader of the wolf pack. Another soldier leaned closer to the young man and wondered what kind of bastard he was looking at. The sharp, toothed mouth of the dead beast came into view. One warrior suggested that the young man might have killed the mystical creature himself. Another immediately called him a fool and told him to stop talking nonsense. One of the marauders reached toward the young man's head and remarked that nobody cared how the fool had died, because they only needed to know whether he possessed anything useful. Suddenly, one of the warriors cried out in pain. A lizard had latched onto his leg. The soldier screamed furiously and accused the reptile of having no brains. Another soldier approached the lizard with a dagger in hand. Martin shouted for the stubborn creature to let go. His comrade told him to stay still because he intended to cut the reptile in half. The bald warrior raised his dagger, but at that very moment, the supposedly unconscious young man suddenly struck him. The blow caused the man to double over in pain. Someone loudly demanded to know what was happening. A fist immediately smashed into the bald soldier's nose, sending him flying backward as blood splattered everywhere. Another soldier shouted the victim's name, revealing that he was called H. The young man glared angrily at the surrounding soldiers and warned them not to touch the lizard. Standing with an axe in his hands, he declared that otherwise he would bite everyone's throats out. The soldiers quickly surrounded him. One of them mocked the young man, claiming that the idiot was clearly looking for a fight. Another demanded once again to know what was happening. The bearded soldier shouted that the scoundrel had killed H. However, the young man looked at his own hands in disgust and replied that the man was still alive. Martin angrily called the young man a bastard and asked whether he truly believed they would allow him to leave peacefully. One soldier drew his sword as the order was given to surround the stranger completely. Armed warriors advanced toward him from all sides. The young man warned them that anyone who valued the feelings of their loved ones should retreat immediately. With wild fury burning in his eyes, he admitted that whenever he killed someone other than animals, he slept terribly at night. An order was then given to kill him. The soldiers rushed forward with furious shouts as the young man leaned slightly forward, preparing himself for battle. In an instant, he dashed past his opponents, striking them repeatedly along the way. One soldier suddenly realized that he had lost an arm and screamed loudly in horror. The bearded warrior stared at the young man in shock and called him a monster. Martin, clutching a crossbow, added that the stranger was a complete bastard. The crossbowmen then raised their weapons. Grinding his teeth in rage, the young man glared at them. An order to open fire was immediately given. As the crossbowmen released their arrows, the lizard suddenly leaped onto one soldier's shoulder, causing him to scream. Several arrows struck the young man directly. The soldiers stared cautiously, trying to determine whether they had finally killed their enemy. However, a swirling red and black cloud suddenly appeared before them and slowly transformed into the shapes of terrifying dragons. The mouth of a particularly massive dragon rose upward as the soldiers looked on in complete shock. One of them screamed that it was a demon. A glowing red eye appeared, later turning white with a yellow iris. Black streams of energy stretched upward from the young man's body as he dropped onto all fours, groaning in pain. Soon, tall trees filled the scene, with strange figures barely visible among the branches. A typical medieval settlement then came into view. The bearded man admitted that he could hardly believe what he had witnessed. Nearby, the corpse of a gigantic wolf rested on a cart while the young man sat chained to a post. Someone asked him whether he had truly defeated the beast alone. Meanwhile, the lizard gnawed at the bars of its cage until someone shouted at it to stop. A young man remarked that it would have been wiser to burn the wolf's corpse immediately. Martin, standing beside an old man, declared that simply chopping the young man into pieces would not be enough punishment, and that something far more terrible should be done to him. The bearded old man approached the chained boy and asked for his name. The young man introduced himself as Anta. The old man then asked why he had done all of this. Anta glared angrily at him and calmly replied that he had simply been hungry. Judging by the expression on his face, the bearded man could hardly believe what he had just heard. Martin, standing behind the old man, declared that there was no need to ask any further questions because they had already seen everything with their own eyes. The toothy dragon appeared once again as Martin explained that the young man before them was the one who had transformed into the creature. Because of this, he recalled the rumors that had recently begun spreading throughout the mountains. A horned monster with glowing blue eyes then came into view. Martin insisted that this was the work of a demon that fed on the dead. However, the old man, whose back was turned toward them, argued that no matter how one looked at him, the chained boy still appeared human. Martin urged the bearded man to examine the wounds of the mystical beast beside which the young man had been discovered. The injuries were revealed, and the man observed that they were bite marks. Ananta, still chained, glared at him angrily. Martin immediately declared that the boy was undoubtedly a demon god in human form. Ananta suddenly burst into laughter. Martin shouted at him, demanding to know what was so amusing. The young man replied that if he truly were an evil god, then he should at least be powerful enough to defeat even a mystical creature. The surrounding soldiers looked at him in fear as he smiled with madness in his eyes and continued his question, asking whether they truly believed chains could restrain someone like him. The scene shifted to ropes tied around the wolf's body beneath the moonlit sky. Anana remarked that the people who had captured him understood nothing. As an eagle flew overhead, he explained that they did not even know what kind of monster they were dealing with or what it consumed. Suddenly, drops of blood splashed onto the old man's collar. Looking upward in shock, he discovered that the supposedly dead wolf had swallowed one of his soldiers. Someone screamed that the corpse had come back to life. Gritting his teeth, Anana corrected them, declaring that it was not an ordinary corpse, but rather a servant of the demon god, a disgusting monster. An alarm immediately rang out above the settlement walls. Countless wolves rushed forward as terrified voices shouted that the demon god was attacking. Behind the pack stood a horrifying horned creature with glowing eyes. Instead of a normal head, it possessed the skull of a ruminant beast. Stretching out its clawed hand, it commanded the wolves as they climbed over the walls. Soldiers screamed that the creatures were already breaking through. The predators soon flooded into the settlement and began slaughtering people mercilessly. Victims cried out desperately for help while flames spread across the village. Wolves burned atop the palisade as chaos consumed the settlement. Then the demon god approached the wall itself. Burning wolves fell from the collapsing barricades while desperate screams echoed through the air. Something dark leaped over the flames, revealing the snarling mouth of a wolf before the monstrous head of the demon god came into view. Soon afterward, its massive muscular arm emerged. The enormous dragon appeared once again. Ananta called upon his thirst and hunger to unite and become his strength. In his monstrous dragon form, he tore apart the wooden fence of the settlement. Blood, flesh, and bones scattered everywhere as two red streaks flashed before the scene. Now fully transformed into a dragon, Ananta approached the god of monsters and declared that he would swallow him whole. White smoke streamed from the dragon's eyes while burning houses stood in the background. Opposite him stood the god of demons, slightly hunched over. Ananta promised to tear his enemy to pieces. Nearby, the lizard with burning eyes glared at the enemy, and declared that death itself would seem merciful compared to what awaited him. The demon god stretched out a clawed paw resembling that of a bird and opened its mouth wide, unleashing a deafening roar. Silhouettes emerged behind the two opponents against the backdrop of the burning settlement. Enraged beasts charged forward, ready to attack the dragon. In response, the dragon seized both a goat and a boar by their heads and smashed them together violently. With another swipe of its clawed paw, the monster tore the animals apart and sent their bodies flying. The dragon swung its limbs relentlessly, exterminating the beasts surrounding it. Blue energy then flowed from the demon god's eyes as it activated its phantom form. The demon god crossed its arms before charging directly at the dragon. The two opponents collided, triggering a massive explosion as black streams of energy erupted upward. What followed was a spectacular battle between two monstrous entities. The dragon opened its jaws wide and struck its opponent with overwhelming force. It grabbed the demon god's arm as blue light glowed from one of the creature's eyes. A massive red fist then crashed downward repeatedly onto the demon god, sending it flying far away before it slammed into the ground with another devastating explosion. The dragon reached toward its fallen enemy once again. However, its upper body slowly transformed back into Ananta's human form. The demon god lay wounded on the ground with a massive glowing injury in its chest. As Ananta approached the defeated enemy, he suddenly found himself holding a young girl by the throat. The lower half of her face became visible, revealing a beautiful young woman. Surprised, Ananta realized that she had apparently never been acting of her own free will. Dust clouds rose around them as he sensed danger approaching. Without warning, someone struck him powerfully in the shoulder. Blood splattered in every direction. Above them, a vulture circled beneath the moonlight before landing nearby. Clutching his bleeding shoulder, Ananta remarked that he had expected something like this. The vulture glared at him predatorily, while Ananta stated that the creature before him was likely the true demon god, one that devoured corpses. Feathers suddenly scattered into the air as the vulture transformed into a sinister-looking man. The man admitted that he was astonished, because he had never expected his precious puppet to be destroyed. It was then revealed that the mysterious figure hiding among the trees earlier had been this very man. He explained that he had been observing Ananta from the moment he first set foot upon the earth. As another vulture soared through the dark sky, the newly revealed demon god carelessly pushed aside the girl, now considering her useless. Ananta slowly rose to his feet and coldly remarked that he had nearly fallen asleep listening to his opponent's endless rambling. He added that he had no interest in hearing such a foolish monologue. The demon god frowned angrily before beckoning Ananta forward with a finger and declaring that he would destroy him completely. The vulture released its sharp claws and spread its massive wings, claiming that its power allowed it to control the souls of the dead. It explained that if it killed Ananta and took control of his corpse, it would gain an invincible warrior capable of leading an army of the undead. The bird once again entered its phantom form. Monsters with glowing eyes appeared everywhere, while humans under the same eerie influence prepared to attack the young man. Ananta stood alone in the center of a vast army of enemies. The demon god declared that the creature whose name he did not even know would soon be crushed and swallowed by the sea of the undead. Instantly, the army surged forward. Wolves bit into Ananta while spears pierced his body. Blood splashed everywhere as countless beasts restrained him. The monstrous bird laughed loudly and mockingly asked whether his enemy had finally run out of strength. The demon god then struck directly, driving its predatory beak through Ananta's torso. It declared that it wished to hear the young man's final desperate scream. Instead, a smile slowly spread across Ananta's face. He began laughing loudly as red light poured from his eyes. A blinding flash exploded across the battlefield. The vulture, like demon god, appeared confused and demanded to know what was happening. Ananta, now radiating terrifying red energy, grinned grotesquely. His face became horrifying to behold as he asked why his opponent could not howl even once like a true animal. At that moment, something enormous and terrifying emerged before the bird. The dragon's jaws clamped onto the vulture and crushed it violently. Blood gushed from the creature's mouth as it screamed in agony. Countless monstrous jaws and claws tore into the demon god, stripping away its very identity. Nearby, the blue eye of the young woman widened in bewilderment as she witnessed the unimaginable horror unfolding before her. A scene so grotesque it seemed born from the mind of a mad artist. Ananta dropped to one knee, still releasing waves of red and black energy. Sweat rolled down the girl's cheeks as he slowly approached her, looking at her with slightly crazed eyes. He calmly explained that she no longer needed to obey the demon god because she was finally free. The girl clutched her head in confusion as visions of shining white wings filled her mind. She claimed that she could see 2 radiant wings. Ananta seemed shocked by her words. As both of them lowered their gazes, he quietly wondered whether she, too, had become a victim of the wings. The girl stared at him in confusion and demanded to know who he truly was. Ananta replied that his name was Ananta. A dragon's head appeared behind him, as he declared himself the heir of the Black Dragon and its sole surviving descendant. He explained that he traveled across the world devouring demons and that he would eventually destroy the winged incarnation. The morning sun shone brightly over countless animal corpses scattered across the battlefield. Standing before the burned remains of the settlement wall, Ananda once again introduced himself as the last surviving descendant of the Black Dragon who traveled the world devouring demons. He repeated that he would be the one to destroy the winged incarnation standing before her. The girl lowered her head in confusion and admitted that she did not understand anything he was talking about. With the lizard resting on his shoulder, Ananda listened as the blonde confessed that she had no idea what the Black Dragon or the winged incarnation even were. Completely overwhelmed, she admitted that she was utterly confused. As the girl lowered her head, the lizard hissed loudly. Ananda remarked that she was mentally exhausted after everything she had experienced. Moments later, the frightened girl suddenly ran away. Soon, she noticed a strange symbol before her. Looking down, she discovered a horned skull lying nearby. When she glanced back, she saw the demon god chasing after her. Black splashes erupted around her as she tripped and fell face first into a puddle. Lifting her blood-covered face, she looked into the puddle and saw a skull with glowing eyes staring back at her. To her horror, she realized she was kneeling beside a river of blood surrounded by thousands of corpses. As she stared at her trembling hands, a creature with shining white wings appeared above her. Looking over her shoulder, she suddenly saw her own severed head lying on the ground beside a smiling pink-haired girl. The strange girl cheerfully greeted her and explained that she had been sleeping restlessly because of nightmares. She asked whether she had dreamed about the bloody river. Before the blonde could fully process the vision, someone called out the name Ruby. Nearby, Ananta ordered the lizard to start a fire. Flames ignited inside the reptile's mouth before it unleashed a massive stream of fire that burned everything in the distance. A towering wall of flames erupted as vague human-like silhouettes rose from within the inferno. Ananta watched the burning destruction sadly, while someone remarked that all the demon god's minions had been destroyed instantly. The pink-haired girl excitedly threw up her hands and declared that Ananta was actually a very kind person. In response, he grabbed her by the collar and lifted her into the air, angrily telling her that a useless traitor like her would be better off remaining silent. The girl merely laughed while Ananta scolded her further, claiming that her foolish chatter had caused unnecessary trouble. Pointing toward the blonde girl sitting nearby, he reminded her that he had fulfilled his part of their agreement and that it was now her turn to pay. The little girl bent forward and teasingly remarked that he was still angry, despite the fact that he should have calmed down long ago. She then looked toward the blonde and asked for the name of the avatar standing before them. The blonde hesitantly introduced herself as Nadia. The pink-haired girl reacted with amazement, saying that she could not believe another victim of the winged incarnation existed besides Ananta. Nadia repeated the phrase in confusion, but Ananta immediately shouted at the pink-haired girl, warning her not to reveal too much information. The girl simply showed him her watch and asked him to be patient. With a press of her finger against the chronometer, a gigantic funnel suddenly opened in the ground beneath them. The two girls and Ananta were pulled downward into the vortex. Nadia shut her eyes in terror before cautiously opening one of them again. To her astonishment, the three of them now stood before a magnificent city built at the foot of an impossibly tall tree. Nadia cried out in surprise. Meanwhile, the pink-haired girl struggled to hold onto a tiny top hat that had mysteriously appeared on her head. She cheerfully explained that a clever rabbit always digs 3 holes before introducing herself properly. A strange rabbit-shaped emblem appeared above her head as she announced that she belonged to the largest information network on the continent, known as Rabbit Foot. She proudly introduced herself as the cutest merchant in the organization, Whitefoot, before pointing toward Ananta and revealing that she had been cooperating with him. Behind them towered a gigantic tree overlooking a magnificent city. Whitefoot explained that they had arrived in Cafes, the largest city in the south. She pointed toward the enormous sacred tree known as the White Lotus and proudly stated that something important was located at its summit. However, Nadia finally lost her patience and shouted for Whitefoot to stop talking. The girl froze with her fingers still raised. Nadia admitted that although she was grateful for being saved from the demon god, she was exhausted from all the endless stories and no longer wanted to hear them. Irritated, she demanded proper answers instead. Her first question was why they had dragged her into such a mysterious city. Ananta turned away and coldly ordered the blonde to remain quiet and follow him. Looking back over his shoulder, he promised that he would soon show her the reason she had been brought there. The travelers passed beneath an archway between the houses as Nadia continued questioning Ananta. She asked what exactly the winged incarnation was and why he sought it so desperately. Grinding his teeth in anger, Ananta described the being as a disgusting creature that imagined itself to be a god. As the two girls walked beside him, Nadia asked him to explain further. Ananta stated that just as avatars were granted human forms and supernatural powers, the winged incarnation possessed the ability to bestow immense powers upon others as well. A horrifying red and black figure struggling to open its mouth briefly appeared before them as he explained that such power was far from perfect. According to him, nobody could truly determine whether it was a blessing or a curse. Still confused, Nadia questioned him again. However, Ananta suddenly announced that they had finally arrived. The scene before them revealed countless chained people gathered along the streets. Their expressions were filled with despair. Among them stood a little girl whose hands were bound in chains. Traders moved through the crowd while bargaining over slaves and mystical creatures alike. Ananta calmly informed Nadia that she was now standing in the slave market of Cafes. Whitefoot, still wearing her tiny top hat, explained that the market's activity had increased dramatically in recent times. Local traders had begun capturing foreigners, wanderers, and vagabonds, even selling mystical creatures such as a tiger with glowing blue eyes. Standing before a heavy door with barred windows, Nadia angrily demanded to know what any of this had to do with the winged incarnation. Before she could react, someone suddenly kicked her in the side. She tumbled down a set of cold stone stairs before crashing onto the floor below. Groaning heavily, Nadia lifted her head and looked around in anger. Frightened prisoners sat around her while a long-haired man stared at her suspiciously. Nearby, she noticed a terrified young girl among the captives. At the top of the stairs, Ananta coldly explained that these prisoners were sacrifices, offerings meant for the winged incarnation. The massive white lotus tree with its glowing crown appeared once more, as he declared that every one of them would eventually be killed during a ritual performed at the summit of the sacred tree. After slamming the dungeon door shut, Ananta added that Nadia herself was no different from the others. Shocked, she stared after him in disbelief. Before leaving completely, he turned back one final time and explained through the bars that the best way to lure the winged incarnation out was by using live bait. Whitefoot smiled calmly as Ananta instructed her to handle the rest. She replied that she understood perfectly. Nadia rushed toward the stairs and screamed for them to stop. Clutching the bars tightly, she demanded to know whether they had truly imprisoned all of these innocent people themselves. Ananta glared at her coldly and asked what she intended to do about it, even if it were true. Furious, Nadia shouted that using weak and innocent people to achieve personal goals was disgusting. She pointed toward the miserable prisoners and demanded to know whether he felt no guilt whatsoever. Ananta stared at her briefly before turning away once more. As he left, he coldly remarked that revenge could never be achieved without staining one's hands with blood. Nadia looked at him with both confusion and disgust. Shaking the bars violently, she declared that she could never accept such cruelty. Whitefoot approached the cell door and admitted that she understood Nadia's feelings. However, she calmly explained that the unfortunate prisoners would soon endure terrible suffering regardless. A sorrowful boy sitting on his knees appeared before them as Whitefoot dramatically claimed that simply imagining their pain was enough to bring tears to her eyes. Yet, despite her words, a smile remained on her face as she pretended to wipe away tears. Furious, Nadia screamed that Whitefoot's behavior was revolting. The girl only continued giggling. Nadia then shouted that neither Whitefoot nor her master would escape punishment for such vile actions. In response, Whitefoot reminded her that while controlled by the demon god, Nadia herself had slaughtered countless people without caring about their lives. The blonde froze in shock as memories of rivers of blood and mountains of corpses resurfaced in her mind. Whitefoot calmly added that even if Nadia had never intended to hurt anyone, it was now impossible to pretend that nothing had happened. Nadia tried to defend herself, but no words came out. Smiling gently, Whitefoot placed her hand over Nadia's and advised her not to direct her anger toward either herself or Ananta. According to Whitefoot, their true enemy was the vile wind incarnation. Elsewhere, massive arena walls resembling a coliseum came into view. Ananta sat quietly against a wall while tightening a protective guard around his arm. Whitefoot explained that the prisoners truly had nothing to do with him personally. Ananta remained silent as he secured the armor on his arm. Eventually, he looked toward Whitefoot and asked what was troubling her. She admitted that she had attempted to persuade Nadia, but it seemed her efforts had failed. Meanwhile, men wearing crowns of thorns escorted the captives through the city. Nadia walked among the chained slaves, while Whitefoot explained that the wing guards were transporting them toward the Temple of the White Lotus. Looking ahead, Nadia stared at the enormous doors before her. Whitefoot continued explaining that sacrifices served as the starting point for meeting the winged incarnation itself. She added that all preparations for the hunt had already been completed, including arrangements to infiltrate the Temple of the White Lotus, which was protected by an impenetrable barrier. A giant sacred tree surrounded by a glowing sphere of energy appeared before them. Whitefoot revealed that Ananta intended to enter the arena and win a branch of the White Lotus, a reward granted only to the arena champion. A warrior standing atop a mountain of corpses while holding such a branch appeared briefly before them. Whitefoot confidently claimed that it would not take long before they finally met the winged incarnation. However, Ananta privately thought the entire process was far too exhausting. An image of an enraged dragon flashed through his mind as he considered how much easier it would be to draw the enemy's attention through a bloody massacre instead. A glowing red eye appeared as he reminded himself that there were lines even he should never cross. Whitefoot's eternal smile faded as Ananta questioned whether she was secretly attempting to create conflict between the kingdoms of humans and beasts. He criticized the plan as unreliable and irrational. The worried girl stared at him while he continued speaking without even looking in her direction. He remarked that he could practically hear her rolling her eyes. Raising his enormous axe, Ananta casually declared that enough time had passed since his last meal and that it was time to burn some extra calories. As he walked away, he instructed Whitefoot to sit quietly and watch from the sidelines. Looking back over his shoulder, he advised her to carefully observe how he hunted animals. Whitefoot smiled and reminded him not to attract unnecessary attention in case something went wrong. Nearby, the lizard either yawned or hissed loudly as Ananta walked through a dark passageway, promising to keep her warning in mind. Elsewhere, a bearded commander ordered his soldiers to form a defensive wall. The warriors obeyed immediately, raising their shields together. Before them stood a gigantic leopard grinning menacingly. The commander shouted for his men not to fear the beast and ordered them to hold formation. Suddenly, someone casually placed a hand on one soldier's shoulder. Startled, the man was thrown backward onto the ground. Ananta calmly walked straight through the line of soldiers without paying attention to their angry protests. He coldly warned them not to provoke him if they valued their lives. The leopard bared its sharp fangs and raised a claw to strike. In response, Ananta attacked with both axes simultaneously. The bearded commander stared in disbelief while Whitefoot smiled confidently. The young man swung his axes relentlessly and severed the leopard's paw. Complaining that everything had become a constant headache, Ananta continued his assault. One helmeted warrior watched in utter shock, unable to comprehend how a mere human could defeat a mystical beast. The leopard collapsed to the ground as Ananta raised his axe before leaping high into the air. He brought both weapons crashing down onto the spotted beast, while horrified spectators watched the battle unfold. Pulling his axe free from the leopard's body, Ananta raised his head and screamed furiously toward the giant white lotus tree. He promised to cut someone into pieces and devour them whole. The glowing crown of the sacred tree shone brightly as its massive gates slowly opened. Later they shut once again. Meanwhile, Nadia looked upward weakly as the prisoners were escorted between gigantic columns toward the tree. Someone addressed the frightened captives from above. Nadia immediately recognized the speaker and glared at him with hatred. A bird perched calmly upon the man's hand as he spread his arms and welcomed everyone to the temple of the goddess. Nadia realized she was staring directly at the winged incarnation itself. The white lotus, protected by a powerful barrier, was regarded as the sacred tree. For reasons unknown, the winged incarnation had settled within it and begun accepting living sacrifices. Those who offered sacrifices were granted the opportunity to fight in the arena of Kefes. Warriors capable of defeating mystical beasts earned both a branch of the White Lotus and the prestigious title of Wing Guard. Back at the dungeon entrance, Whitefoot explained that their plan was to secretly infiltrate the temple by disguising Nadia as a living sacrifice. Smiling confidently, she claimed that this simple strategy formed the core of their entire operation. She added that Nadia was free to ask any remaining questions. Nadia stared at her in surprise before asking why Ananta hated the winged incarnation so much. She wondered whether it was simply because of the power the being possessed. Whitefoot quietly replied that she could not reveal everything. A battlefield engulfed in flames appeared before them as Whitefoot calmly stated that if vengeance itself had a physical form, it would undoubtedly be Ananta. Soon afterward, the winged incarnation addressed the exhausted prisoners gathered before him. He arrogantly declared that those who had suffered greatly should raise their heads and gaze upon his radiant face. The miserable captives listened in silence as the man proudly called himself a saint admired by the entire world, declaring himself both the master of the White Lotus and the winged incarnation. The scoundrel claimed that he delivered heaven's blessings to the mortal realm. Spreading his arms proudly, he introduced himself as Balzac. Nadia frowned with disgust while Balzac calmly instructed the terrified prisoners to prepare for liberation by entrusting their souls to the winged savior. Suddenly, a girl wearing brown clothes cried out desperately, begging for mercy. Standing beside a girl who looked almost identical to her, she pleaded for her sister's freedom, insisting they had done nothing wrong. Balzac smiled warmly and stretched out his hand as though preparing to reward her kindness. The girl began thanking him, but before she could finish speaking, her head exploded into pieces. The sister she had tried so desperately to save stared in horror at the remains. The prisoners trembled in terror while Nadia glared at Balzac with burning rage. Seated upon his throne, Balzac calmly remarked that everyone became equal in the face of death. Crossing one leg over the other, he explained that the dead girl had merely been freed from fear and regret. Smiling cruelly, he promised that the surviving sister would soon reunite with her sibling in the afterlife. Standing between two servants wearing thorned crowns, Nadia clenched her fists angrily. One of the servants reached toward his sword as black streams of energy suddenly rose into the air. A horned skull with glowing eyes appeared as the darkness wrapped itself around the servants' necks. Balzac watched the scene indifferently, while Nadia declared that he was not a savior at all, but nothing more than a cold-blooded murderer. Her eyes glowed ominously as she called upon Essel and began transforming. The skill, Kernan, activated as black streams of energy swirled around her face. Prisoners stared in shock while someone screamed that a monster had appeared. The outline of the horned demon god emerged behind Nadia. Memories flashed through her mind. The bloody river, Whitefoot's warning that she could never pretend nothing had happened, and the little girl's wish for her not to lose. The sad little boy still gazed at her sorrowfully as Nadia looked back at him with sympathy. Then, a determined smile spread across her face. Long branches suddenly erupted around the prisoners. Using the skill Acis, Nadia caused the vines to wrap around the thorn, crowned guards and form a protective dome around the captives. Gripping the intertwined roots tightly, Nadia shouted for everyone not to be afraid. Clenching her fist, she declared that she would protect them all. However, she immediately sensed danger approaching. A massive explosion erupted before her as Balzac calmly remarked that she was merely throwing around empty promises. Resting one hand upon his belt, the scoundrel mockingly declared that the insignificant girl before him had somehow gathered the courage to stand against him. The great and powerful figure watched as clouds of smoke rose around the girl. She declared that she had a name, and that her name was Nadia. Greenish branches curled around her head as the blonde girl raised her fists and proclaimed that she was a child of nature. Balzac laughed at her and insulted her, calling her an impudent fool. The intertwined branches rose upward as Nadia tried to understand what was opposing her. She wondered whether it was an invisible shock wave or some form of telekinesis. Instinctively, she blocked the attacks, though they did not seem very strong. The intertwined roots then transformed into a sharpened hammer, which was revealed to be the result of using the Sousa's skill. Nadia hoped to crush her enemy with even greater force. An incredibly powerful flash erupted between the opponents. Balzac smiled as the outlines of wings appeared behind him, and he ordered his forces to tear the girl to shreds. Meanwhile, Ananta stood over the corpse of the dead leopard and looked around. The spectators tried to understand what had happened. One of them asked what that strange sound had been, while another claimed it seemed to have come from the White Lotus. A warrior in a helmet stared at the towering tree, trying to figure out what was happening, while Ananta frowned and looked upward. Nadia stared ahead in bewilderment as she witnessed a powerful explosion that sent long, torn streaks flying through the air. She could not believe that her opponent had dispersed such a powerful skill in an instant. Balzac stood proudly before her, and Nadia realized that his attacks had suddenly become much stronger. A strange cylinder with a dome appeared above the girl. Balzac mockingly asked whether Nadia was capable of anything more serious. He snapped his fingers, causing the massive object hanging above her to crash down. Nadia looked upward in shock, trying to understand what it was. A shadow crept over her, and within it, the outline of a dragon became visible. She saw a torn wing and realized that a monster stood before her. A small boy screamed from behind the branches, warning Nadia to be careful. Animal-like terror filled the blonde girl's eyes as a sharp projectile pierced her body. Balzac smiled smugly while a massive dragon towered behind him. He proudly introduced the creature as his faithful servant. Elsewhere, in the arena littered with human and animal corpses, Ananta stood with an axe in his hands before a mortally wounded tiger. The beast roared as the hero gazed into its eyes and declared that, even if it hated him, it should not turn away from its executioner in the face of death. He then raised his axe above the animal. Blood splattered from the tiger's paws. Two warriors watched the hero finish the beast off. One of them turned to Duke Bernhard and remarked that everyone was confused by the unexpected turn of events. Nearby lay several warriors, both living and dead. Bernhard's servant stated that the hero would undoubtedly win the contest and take the championship from the one who was expected to triumph. Covered in blood, Ananta listened as an announcement echoed throughout the arena, informing the citizens of Cafis that the winner had finally been determined. The warrior asked Duke Bernhard what he intended to do next. Men dressed in white cloaks entered the arena, and one of them praised the hero as a valiant warrior, before announcing that the winged guards would reward him with a branch of the White Lotus. Duke Bernhard calmly ordered his servants to remain patient, insisting that everything was proceeding according to plan. He assured them that, no matter what happened, the branch would eventually belong to them. The men in white approached the hero, Ananda looked at them with visible irritation as a richly decorated box containing the white lotus branch was presented before him. The hero reached out, took the branch, and clenched it tightly in his fist. Duke Bernhard declared that they would obtain the branch at any cost. Elsewhere, two frightened children stared ahead in horror. Nadia, wounded in the stomach, crawled toward them as a monstrous dragon-like creature loomed before her. Balzac smugly asked whether she truly intended to protect those people at all costs, claiming that her determination was almost touching. The captives destined for sacrifice looked sorrowfully at the scoundrel, standing atop a pile of wooden debris. Balzac claimed that those people were doomed and that ending their suffering quickly was an act of mercy. Nadia twisted her mouth in contempt as black streams rose above her head. She declared that Balzac was no savior, because he disguised cruelty as mercy. The black streams multiplied as Nadia boldly shouted that there was nothing human left in him. She accused him of being nothing more than a terrible demon god who sowed death and fear. Balzac listened thoughtfully before asking for permission to explain what true salvation really was. He pointed toward the girl and declared that sufferers would only find salvation by falling into the abyss of despair. Suddenly, dark shoots burst from the ground beneath the sacrificial victims. One man was impaled upon a spike as Nadia looked around in horror. Countless black thorns pierced the victims, who screamed desperately for mercy as they died. Tendrils surged toward the dragon hanging above them and pierced the monster's body in numerous places. Balzac joyfully raised his hands and proclaimed that this was the blessing of the winged savior. His expression became completely insane as he screamed that the prisoner would receive a special honor. Red energy flowed before the terrified girl, while white streams burst from the dragon's body. Nadia tried to understand what was flowing through the branches of the white lotus, and within the streams she noticed the outline of a skull. Smiling widely, Balzac declared that this was hell on earth. Stretching out his hand, he ranted that unlike him, all living beings were mortal. The white streams reached the guards who served him, and he screamed that only he could give meaning to worthless lives. The mask fell from one guard's face, revealing the features of a mummy beneath it. Balzac continued shouting that everyone who could still see must understand that their life force fed the white lotus. He proudly declared that he was creating an immortal warrior. Behind him stood the back of a dragon as Balzac explained that the flow of life must circulate and become light capable of protecting the white lotus. The dragon, pierced by streams of red and white energy, opened its mouth and released a deafening roar. Balzac triumphantly proclaimed that this was the winged blessing. Nadia stared at him with disgust and demanded to know what kind of monster he truly was and how many lives he had absorbed. Balzac beckoned her closer with his finger as brown tendrils resembling roots wrapped around her body. Calmly approaching the immobilized girl, he admitted that he had long since lost count. He passed by her and called her a presumptuous woman before asking whether she had any final words. Filled with disgust, Nadia screamed for him to go to hell. Smiling coldly, Balzac raised his right hand and mocked her for uttering such a cliché insult. At that moment, the doors behind him suddenly burst open. A black sphere shot through the air, passing beside Balzac's face before tearing away half the head of one of his servants. Ananda appeared midair, raising a sharp weapon to strike. Balzac stood frozen as the iris of his eye reflected the approaching hero. Ananda drove his weapon directly into Balzac's forehead, leaving the branch embedded in the villain's skull. Landing on one knee, the hero immediately turned toward Nadia and asked whether she was safe. He then remarked that she was extremely lucky. Balzac recognized the object lodged in his eye and identified it as a branch of the white lotus. Amazed, he admitted that he never expected anyone to actually win the tournament and reach this place. Ananda glared angrily at the villain and demanded to know what kind of bastard he was supposed to be. He then turned toward Nadia and irritably asked where she had hidden the winged incarnation. The girl stared at him in confusion, unable to understand what he meant. Balzac's face darkened with rage as he declared that it was not enough for the hero to invade his sanctuary. He had also dared to insult his holiness. Sharp claws began growing from his fingers as he threatened to tear the intruders apart. Standing directly before him, Ananda rudely told him to shut up and called him an imposter. His eyes and body began glowing with ominous red and black energy as he stated that he could not sense any true winged incarnation nearby. Elsewhere, a guard raised his sword to strike, but Duke Bernhard appeared before him, wearing a serious expression. The bearded warrior cut the guard down while his subordinates slaughtered the white-robed servants. Bernhard ordered his men to eliminate every enemy in sight. The commander later explained that he had waited for the tournament winner to appear after the results were announced, but the warrior who had received the white lotus branch had vanished. Suspecting a trap, Bernhard entered the forbidden area and discovered numerous corpses alongside strange wooden growths. Looking upward in amazement, he concluded that all of it was likely the work of the young man who had won the competition. Most likely, the hero's true target had been the winged incarnation itself. Back in the chamber, Anana stood before Balzac while Nadia, still trapped within thick roots, asked who their enemy really was if he was not the winged incarnation. Gazing angrily downward, Ananta demanded to know whether she had ever truly used her eyes. He reminded her that the winged incarnation was known for possessing 3 pairs of pure white wings. The hero pointed out the wings behind Balzac's back and declared that they were clearly defective. He mockingly advised Balzac to at least attempt to imitate the true appearance of the being he claimed to be. Anana glared at him and accused him of doing nothing but speaking nonsense. Balzac coldly replied that he had no intention of answering further. He ordered his servants to kill the hero, and they immediately rushed forward. Ananta's hand transformed into a dragon's claw, slashing through the air and severing the roots that bound Nadia. The blonde girl fell heavily to the ground. Without even turning toward her, Ananta shouted for her to stop hesitating and escape immediately. As Nadia looked around, she noticed the severed heads of 2 children among the fallen roots. At the same time, guards wearing thorned crowns charged toward Anana. The hero struck with his left hand, then his right, knocking off one guard's head entirely. Spikes protruded from the mouth of a monstrous creature, which spat them toward the enemy. Nadia shielded the children with her body as clouds of dust rose between the pillars. Meanwhile, Ananta's clawed hand scraped against the stone floor as he completed his transformation into a dragon. The dragon lunged toward the winged creature, opening its jaws and extending a clawed paw before delivering a devastating strike. The 2 monstrous beings stood opposite each other as the battle intensified. Ananta's right hand became surrounded by a halo of red energy before he struck again, sending blood spraying in every direction and shattering Balzac's teeth. The dragon suddenly looked back as if sensing something, only to receive a powerful counterattack that slammed him into the floor. Balzac planted a clawed paw on the dragon's chest and admitted that he was facing a truly powerful opponent. Towering over the fallen dragon, he declared that the hero was worthy of witnessing his full power. Stretching out his claws, Balzac swore that he would crush him completely. Balzac seemed certain that he would not give the enemy a single chance to escape. As the 2 monsters faced each other, Nadia bent over the unconscious children again. Then the dragon rose to its feet and jumped upward to avoid the roots reaching for it. Long shoots lashed toward Anana, and the roots slammed into the columns as he moved along them. The monster's eyes glowed red, and Balzac, his body now radiating a reddish light, realized that no matter how many blows he landed, it would not matter as long as the white lotus remained. It would simply restore itself again and again. Seeing the strange red and black structures around him, Balzac understood that there was no time left to hesitate. The dragon, smiling, looked up toward the hole in the ceiling, where black human figures were falling toward the tree. Its hand began to glow red and black, and with a powerful push from the floor, the monster launched itself high into the air. Balzac and Nadia both stared in shock as Anana raised his right hand to strike. The dragon crashed into the stone, and an explosion like blast tore open a huge hole in the ceiling. At last, the roots caught the dragon. Balzac looked at the enemy, now entangled in the shoots, and asked whether he had really intended to bury everyone under the rubble. The scoundrel only smiled and asked whether the hero had wanted to do something else foolish. Anana stared back and demanded to know how many lives Balzac had taken over the years. Looking down at the dragon's legs, Balzac admitted that he was tired of it all and had lost count a long time ago. The dragon laughed, and wings began to grow behind him while roots rose from the ground and held him tightly. Balzac said that the burden of the suffering he had caused would make the villain collapse in death. Behind the dragon, a terrible monster with burning eyes and sharp teeth appeared. Anana then transformed into a phantom form. Above them, the hole in the ceiling remained open as Balzac looked up in fear. People began running toward the opening from all sides and fell downward. Balzac shouted in panic, asking what the hell this was and demanding that the falling bodies stay away from him, but human corpses literally buried him. Nadia watched the chaos in disbelief and asked what she was seeing. Then a clawed hand grabbed Balzac by the face, and a mountain of black corpses formed around the monster. He screamed and struggled to break free. The scene shifted and Nadia and the 2 children were now in the foreground. Someone reported that a living victim had been found. Cracks appeared in the sky again, and a white beam fell upon the bird-headed creature. A blinding flash followed. Nadia squinted against the light and saw a horn being standing with 1 foot on Balzac's head. The young man looked at her, and Nadia stared in astonishment at the newly arrived creature. Dust swirled beneath her feet as the figure expressed hope that her journey had been pleasant. A child's head was visible behind the blonde girl, and Nadia looked at her companion with concern. The long-haired figure, seen from behind, remarked that Baron had greeted her rather rudely. His muscular torso was visible as he said that he had come to retrieve the winged incarnation. Nearby, a long-haired man with white hair looked sadly ahead while cracks spread across the sky above the tree. Someone called this a daily report. Whitefoot watched everything carefully, and said that she had witnessed a rupture in space above the White Lotus. A lizard peered out from behind the tree, and the girl concluded that Ananta must already have encountered the winged incarnation. Before them stood a horned warrior in golden armor. Whitefoot added that if the one assisting the winged creature had appeared, then it must already be inside the city. Elsewhere, the little girl spoke to someone on an old telephone. A shirtless, long-haired young man stood before her, and from another angle, a heart was seen as Nadia clutched her chest. The blonde approached a warrior in golden armor who was kneeling on one knee. At first, she struggled to understand who he was, but it quickly became clear that Balzac had suffered badly. The blonde asked what he was doing there. Balzac looked at the man angrily and asked whether the bastard had really forgotten him. He bared his sharp teeth and said that he could never forget him, because this was his former master, the heartless creature who had torn the wings from his faithful servant. The blonde raised an index finger and explained that he had taken the wings to punish someone intoxicated by false glory. The horned warrior grabbed the villain by the neck, and the blonde man replied that wings were given only to those worthy of ascending to heaven. Balzac, showing his shark-like teeth again, snapped that the boy had no right to speak that way to the man who had admired him more than anyone else. The blonde answered that the villain had sacrificed millions of lives to create a monster and recover his wings. As he placed a hand on the villain's body, the blonde frowned and said that stupid Balzac did not deserve any of it. The villain opened his mouth wide, and then the horned warrior released his grip. A pile of corpses lay before them. In the distance, a yellow eye was visible, and two figures could be seen through the dust. The blonde looked toward the sun hanging low on the horizon and said that he had a dream. He wanted to find the edge of the world, where this world connected with the land of the gods. The blonde, appearing almost childlike in this moment, declared that he would not stop until his dream was fulfilled. He smiled as he said that he would do it, even if he had to turn the entire world against him.